Welcome to the debate. Last year, nearly 5,000 businesses were dragged into court. And it wasn't for catastrophic data breaches or massive financial fraud.
Right. It was because their digital storefronts are just, well, fundamentally broken for millions of users.
Exactly. We are looking at a 20% year-over-year surge in digital accessibility lawsuits. And the truly startling part of the data from our source material is that 69% of those lawsuits are specifically targeting e-commerce businesses.
Yeah, it's an absolute avalanche of litigation aimed squarely at online retail.
It really is. So today, we're digging into the root cause of this crisis. And I am going to argue that this massive wave of lawsuits is fundamentally a failure of digital infrastructure and architecture. The e-commerce industry has built these incredibly complex systems, but, they failed to treat accessibility as foundational engineering.
And I look at that exact same 20% surge and I see an entirely different driver. I will argue that focusing primarily on the code completely misses the reality of the environment these businesses actually operate in.
How so?
Because this is a predictable, systemic, legal, and financial trap. The mechanics of out-of-court settlements have basically created a highly lucrative cottage industry for plaintiffs' firms. I mean, this isn't just a story about bad coding practices, right? It is a reoccurring cost of doing business engineered by financial incentives.
I hear that, but I think we have to start by looking at what an e-commerce site actually is today, because it's not a static brochure. The reason we are seeing online retail take 69% of the incoming fire is because of what the material calls interactive surface areas.
Right, the complexity of the sites.
Exactly. Think about the modern shopping experience. You have vast product catalogs, dynamic filtering systems, carousel image galleries, multi-step checkout flows.
Account portals, those little live chat widgets popping up.
Yes. Every single one of those components is a complex piece of engineering, and every single point of interaction is a potential point of structural failure for a user relying on assistive technology.
I completely agree that the technology is complex, but the sheer volume of this litigation, almost 5,000 lawsuits, it doesn't just happen organically because a checkout flow has a lot of moving parts. I mean, the complexity has been there for years.
So what's changed then?
What's changed is the legal strategy. The source material points out that 43% of surveyed e-commerce leaders say they have already faced a claim or a lawsuit.
Wow, almost half.
Almost half the industry. That doesn't happen by accident. Plaintiffs' firms are deliberately hunting for what the material describes as recurring fixable patterns of inaccessibility. They aren't looking for obscure edge case glitches.
Right, they're looking for the basics.
Exactly. They are using automated tools to scrape thousands of websites to find the absolute lowest hanging fruit, specifically because the economics heavily favor them.
But wait, those automated tools wouldn't find anything if the digital doors weren't left wide open in the first place. You're focusing on the fact that lawyers are finding these flaws, but the flaws themselves are basic, fundamental usability barriers.
Well, they are barriers, yes.
The material is very clear on what is actually generating these lawsuits. We are talking about images that completely lack alt text. For someone using a screen reader, an image without alt text is just a blank void. They have literally no idea what product they are looking at.
Sure, that's true.
We're talking about checkout forms with unlabeled fields. I mean, imagine trying to buy something and the system refuses to tell you which box is for your credit card number and which is for your zip code.
Yes, those are real barriers, and they absolutely need to be fixed. But I think you are missing the financial mechanism that keeps those exact barriers in place year after year.
Which is what?
Let's look at the actual economics of these lawsuits. Most of these cases do not go to trial. They don't result in massive jury verdicts that force a company to radically change its ways. The data shows they settle out of court, usually for somewhere between $5,000 and $25,000 per incident.
Right, per incident.
And that number is very specific, and it is very deliberate.
Why? Because it's just under the threshold of what it would cost to actually fight it in court?
Exactly. It's a settlement trap. Put yourself in the shoes of a CFO or an engineering manager at a mid-size retailer on a Tuesday morning. A demand letter lands on your desk for $10,000 because of a keyboard trap in your checkout modal.
Okay, so you have to decide how to handle it.
Right. You look at your options. Option A, you halt your current product development. Audit your massive legacy codebase, pull engineers off profit-generating projects, and retrain them to fix the accessibility issues natively.
Which takes time and money.
It might cost you $150,000 in lost time and resources. Option B, you cut a check for $10,000 and the letter goes away today. I mean, it is economically rational in the short term to just pay the ransom.
But it's a completely false economy. I mean, I understand the CFO's math in a vacuum, but ignoring fundamental coding practices because the immediate fine is cheap is exactly like leaving your digital doors unlocked.
I don't know if I'd go that far.
Let's use a cybersecurity analogy. If a company ignored basic cybersecurity protocols, or, if they built the database so poorly that customer data was exposed daily, we would blame the company's architectural choices.
Well, sure, because the risk is massive.
Right. We wouldn't just blame the hackers for exploiting the vulnerability. We would say, you didn't build your infrastructure correctly. Why should digital accessibility be treated any differently than database stability or server routing?
Because the incentive structures are completely different. That cybersecurity analogy sounds great, but it really falls apart under scrutiny.
How so?
If you ignore a massive cybersecurity flaw, the ultimate consequence is a catastrophic data breach that destroys consumer trust, invites massive federal fines, and could literally bankrupt the company. The financial incentive is heavily weighted toward fixing the root problem.
Okay, true.
With accessibility, the legal environment has artificially capped the immediate pain. The cost of settling is just low enough to prevent systemic architectural change.
So they just pay it and move on?
Exactly. By settling without remediating the actual barrier on the site, companies guarantee the underlying pattern will remain in the code, which generates another claim next year. It's a toll booth.
I get where you're coming from, but, making a poor, short-sighted financial calculation doesn't absolve a company of its architectural failure. You're saying they're trapped by the economics, but there is a clear structural way out of this vulnerability.
A structural way out?
Yes, and this brings us right to the efficacy of standards. The material points directly to WCAG 2.1 AA. For those who aren't in the weeds on this, WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines.
Right.
The AA level is essentially the internationally recognized benchmark for what makes a website accessible. It outlines specific rules for color contrast, keyboard navigation, and how code interacts with screen readers. It is the standard that regulators and courts most frequently reference.
It is the standard, yes, but adopting it is entirely different from just knowing it exists.
Right, and that's exactly my point. If an e-commerce business adopts WCAG 2.1 AA not as some one-time audit they ran 3 years ago, but as an ongoing operational shield, it changes the entire dynamic of this legal trap you're talking about.
I'm not so sure that's realistic for most teams.
Well, if you treat WCAG 2.1 AA as core infrastructure, you systematically close the exact barriers that generate these claims. Even if a demand letter slips through, demonstrating that you actively build to this standard and, have ongoing processes to maintain it shows profound good faith in a legal dispute.
But does good faith actually stop a lawsuit?
It future-proofs the business against regulations that, as we know, are getting more specific and heavily enforced. You fortify your digital infrastructure and the legal trap basically disappears.
I deeply challenge the practicality of that defense in the immediate term. You say adopt the standard as if an engineering team can just flip a switch on a Friday afternoon.
I never said it was easy.
As the material notes, becoming WCAG 2.1A compliant overnight is simply not achievable for most businesses.
I'm not saying it's an overnight fix. It obviously requires dedicated architectural overhaul.
But while you are doing that overhaul, the meter is still running on the legal risk. These e-commerce platforms are incredibly complex, living ecosystems. They have thousands of product pages updating daily, dynamic inventory, third-party plugins.
Right, they're constantly changing.
Exactly. If you are an engineering manager, you probably don't have the bandwidth to rebuild a legacy codebase while simultaneously hitting your quarterly feature shipment goals. And I heavily question this idea that demonstrating good faith protects you from plaintiff firms.
You don't think courts look favorably on a company actively working toward a recognized international standard?
A court might, eventually, if you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to get there, but the plaintiff's firm sending the demand letter, They don't care about your internal multi-year roadmap toward compliance.
Because they just want the quick settlement.
Right. Remember how I mentioned these automated web scrapes? They write a script that scans the code of your website, the DOM, looking for missing area labels.
Which are crucial for screen readers.
Right. An area label is basically a hidden name tag in the code that tells a screen reader exactly what a visual element does. If your button just looks like a magnifying glass to a sighted user, the area label tells the software this is the search button.
Right.
If the script finds those labels are missing, it auto-generates a lawsuit. The bot does not care about your good faith. It cares that the tag is missing today, which means a $25,000 settlement today.
But that is exactly why it has to be treated as an infrastructure requirement. You are treating accessibility as a feature that can be delayed on a product roadmap. I am saying it needs to be integrated into the foundational deployment pipeline.
In theory, sure.
You don't push code that breaks your payment gateway, right? And you shouldn't push code that lacks ARIA labels.
But the compliance target keeps moving. The law isn't static. Because regulations in this space are evolving, a company can spend a massive portion of its budget aligning with one interpretation of the WCAG guidelines, only to find the legal risk remains perpetually high.
Because the guidelines update.
Because a new iteration is released or a new legal precedent emerges in a different jurisdiction. The goalposts move, ensuring the legal trap stays sprung.
I think assuming that structured progress is futile just because the target evolves is a very dangerous mindset. Yes, achieving WCAG 2.1 AA requires sustained effort, but the material is clear. Mature companies start with an audit, they prioritize high-risk areas like checkout flows and core navigation, and they integrate accessibility checks into new feature deployment.
Okay, but again, that takes significant time and resources.
It does, but that is an infrastructure mindset. And frankly, we need to look at the ultimate impact of failing to adopt this mindset. You keep focusing heavily on the line item cost, the mechanical $5,000 or $25,000 settlement checks.
Because that's what drives the immediate behavior.
Maybe, but I argue that the most devastating impact of these lawsuits isn't the settlement cost at all. It is the reputational damage.
Reputational damage? Compared to the systemic legal risk?
Absolutely. Think about how consumer-facing e-commerce brands position themselves today. They spend years and millions of marketing dollars building a narrative that they are inclusive, customer-first, and welcoming to everyone.
True, brand image is a huge investment.
Right. So when a public lawsuit alleges that a brand's digital storefront explicitly excluded people with disabilities, that a user literally could not buy a product because of their physical limitations, that cuts incredibly deep into brand equity.
It's a bad look, certainly.
A lawsuit like that completely dismantles the inclusive narrative. That reputational cost is way harder to quantify on a balance sheet than a lawyer's fee, but it is far more catastrophic to a modern consumer brand.
I hear you. And the brand perception risk is certainly real. Nobody wants the PR nightmare of being labeled exclusionary. But focusing on brand reputation completely misses the most massive, tangible consequence sitting right there in the source material.
What do you mean?
The ultimate cost here is a hidden financial drain that completely dwarfs the legal fees and the PR damage combined. Let me drop the specific number from the material because it is staggering. There is $260 billion in unrecoverable sales sitting behind accessibility failures at checkout.
$260 billion.
$260 billion. Let that sink in. We are talking about cart abandonment on a colossal scale.
That is an insane number.
Let's walk through how this actually happens. A user with a motor impairment spends 20 minutes on your site adding items to their cart. They go to checkout. The checkout modal pops up, but because of poor coding, they can't navigate it using their keyboard.
So they're just trapped.
They are trapped. Or, a user with low vision gets to the final step, but the submit order button has such low color contrast that they can't read it. What do? They don't write an angry letter to your PR department.
Right, they close the tab.
They close the tab. They take their money to a competitor whose site actually works.
They abandon the transaction right at the finish line.
Exactly, and the company never even knows why. They just see a spike in their cart abandonment metrics and assume, the shipping costs were too high.
Wow.
Framing this purely as a legal defense strategy or a reputation management issue entirely misses the reality that every single dollar spent closing these architectural gaps
is massive revenue recovery.
I see your point.
The legal trap I'm talking about isn't just the settlement check itself. The trap is that companies are so distracted by swatting away these $5,000 nuisance letters that they are entirely ignoring the billions of dollars they are bleeding out through broken checkout flows. The legal risk is just a flashing warning light for a massive revenue leak.
That is an incredibly powerful way to frame it. And honestly, I think it brings us to a fascinating area of overlap in our perspectives.
Oh, how so?
Well, if we look closely at both the infrastructure failure and the financial leakage, the takeaway is undeniably clear. The industry absolutely must shift its fundamental mindset. We have to stop viewing digital accessibility as a legal battle to be fought, or, a PR crisis to be managed.
Right.
It must be viewed as a permanent, non-negotiable piece of digital infrastructure.
Because treating it as a one-off project is what gets you caught in the loop.
Right. Just as you do not secure a database once in 2018 and assume you're safe forever, you cannot treat accessibility as a box to check. It requires ongoing audits. It requires prioritizing high-risk interactive surfaces like core navigation and checkout.
Yeah.
And most importantly, it requires engineering teams to treat a missing ARIA label or an inaccessible form field with the exact same severity as a broken database query. If the code breaks the user experience for someone with a disability, the code is broken. Period. It is the architectural foundation of the modern web.
And while I agree that the code must be fixed, my perspective remains that business leaders cannot afford to ignore the economic realities imposed by the legal system. Understanding the mechanics of the out-of-court settlement trap is essential.
You have to know the landscape.
Exactly. You have to grasp how plaintiffs' firms hunt for these recurring patterns. If you don't understand the legal vulnerability, you will never properly prioritize the engineering resources to fix it.
Right, the motivation just won't be there.
And when you combine that legal reality with the staggering $260 billion in lost revenue, it becomes incredibly clear why accessibility has become what the material calls the mandatory price of admission to compete globally.
It is an economic reality, but, one born from an architectural flaw. Despite our different framing of the core driver, whether this crisis is fundamentally an engineering failure or a systemic legal vulnerability, we absolutely converge on one point from the material.
Which is?
Treating accessibility lawsuits as isolated, one-time financial settlements is a completely unsustainable strategy. Paying the settlement fee without ever addressing the underlying code is a recipe for disaster.
It is the definition of a terrible business strategy. Whether you view it as the structural collapse of your digital building or a legal trap designed to extract capital, paying a ransom to ignore a broken pipeline makes no sense.
Exactly.
You haven't actually removed the risk, you've just reset the clock until the next demand letter arrives. And worse, you are still actively blocking customers from handing you their money.
Reflecting on this whole discussion, I think understanding both the architectural requirements and the legal realities provides a much sharper, more comprehensive picture of the modern e-commerce landscape.
It really does.
The incredible figure of $260 billion in cart abandonment suggests there is just so much more to explore here. It isn't just a conversation about avoiding compliance fines, it is a massive conversation about user experience, intersectional design, and pure revenue generation.
Absolutely. E-commerce businesses are leaving a massive segment of the global market out in the cold.
Yeah.
It really forces us to ask a broader question. How many other blind spots exist in the digital economy? Where else is bad code quietly costing billions of dollars in lost opportunity, all while businesses are distracted by the immediate, visible nuisance of a lawsuit?
That's a great point.
If companies are this blind to a $260 billion checkout failure, what else are they missing?
Which circles right back to the physical storefront analogy. If you wouldn't dream of building a physical flagship retail store without a wheelchair ramp or a functional front door, you simply cannot continue to build multi-million-dollar digital platforms with checkout buttons that only work for half the population.
Right.
The digital doors must be opened structurally and fundamentally to everyone.
It's the only viable path forward for online retail.
It really is. Well, thank you all for joining us for this discussion.